Hey guys, it's Mrs. Olenichek, and today we're going to talk about ecology and some of the vocabulary and concepts that you're going to use throughout this unit. So when we organize ecosystems, we kind of break it down into levels, starting with an individual, which would be your organism, and working all the way up to the biosphere, which would be all the living things on the planet. So if you look at the planet, we start off with an organism, so that's a single living thing. If you have a group of organisms of the same species living in the same space, we call that a population. If you have a group of populations of different species that are all hanging out, that would be your community. When you add in the non-living things like light and temperature, then you're going to get your ecosystem. And then the whole thing together is considered the biosphere. So that's everywhere on the planet that you can find living things. So here's another way of visualizing that. So if you start off with your fish, that's a single living thing. That would be an organism. If you get a group of fish of the same species, all living in one space, interacting with each other, that's your population. When you add in the other living factors in that area, that's your community. If you add in the non-living stuff, then you get an ecosystem, and then all the living things all together are the biosphere. And ecologists study different levels, right? So some people will focus on just population dynamics, others will look at how communities interact with each other, other ecologists think about ecosystems, and really they specialize in these different areas. So when we think about the ecosystem or your environment, there's two factors that are always interacting with each other. You have biotic factors and abiotic factors. Biotic factors are things that are alive, or at least were alive at some point. Sometimes we think of those as organic compounds. Abiotic factors are non-living things, but these also are going to have a huge influence on the ecosystem and how it functions. So heat, temperature, well, heat and temperature are the same. Soil, wind, how much water is available, how much sunlight an area gets. These are all factors that are going to influence what organisms can survive in that area, particularly plants, and then the rest of us kind of depend on the plants. So here are those definitions for you. A species is a group of individuals that can breed and produce viable offspring. So essentially, organisms that can have babies that can have babies. A population is a group of individuals of the same species in the same area. So a population is always composed of the same species of organisms. So all of these are ducks, they would all be the same species, and so they would be considered a population. Now a community brings in all of the other living things in that area that are going to interact and influence the behaviors of each other. Again, your ecosystem is a community plus those physical or abiotic factors. So here you would have the water, the sunlight, the temperature. A biome is a way of describing an area based on its climate. So the climate is the seasons or lack of seasons, the temperature, the precipitation, and all of that is going to influence the type of plants that can survive in an area, and the plants in turn influence the type of animals that could survive in an area. So here's a map showing some of the major biomes on the planet. If you check the blend, we also have, I found a map of the biomes in Texas, and you'll notice that we kind of are in between a whole bunch of different types of biomes over here. So it's kind of interesting. And then the biosphere is the part of the earth that supports life. So test yourself, see if you can fill in all of the vocabulary here. and see if you can answer this question. So for this one, if we're looking at things that contain only abiotic factors, we've got soil in all of them. Well, that's abiotic. Water, producers, those would be plants. So nope, that one's out. Light's definitely not living. Here you have consumers and producers. That's not going to work. So we've got air. Okay, that's non-living. And rainfall. So group 3 is going to be the one that's only abiotic factors. Okay, now let's talk about energy flow. So when we look at ecosystems and we study the organisms that live there, oftentimes we also look at the energy and how it moves through the system. Generally, we're thinking about what's doing the eating and what's getting eaten, because that's how energy is flowing. It's basically how the food moves through an ecosystem. So we start dividing or categorizing organisms. You have autotrophs, also known as producers, and these are organisms that can make their own food. So we are not producers. Just because you can cook something doesn't mean you're making your own food. Plants are the classic example of producers because they can use inorganic sunlight to create organic compounds or food that they can then use for energy. We fall into the heterotroph, so using other to get our food, or consumer category. And there's some different subgroups there. So you have herbivores that eat plants, carnivores that eat meat, omnivores that eat everything, and then detritivores or decomposers, which break down dead materials. Some ways to remember those, so I think of herbs and spices, carne for carnivores, and then omni for everything. Some other interactions that we're going to be looking at as we go through this unit involve things called symbiosis. And there's three major categories there. You've got mutualism, which is one where both benefit. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other one isn't affected. And then parasitism, which is where one organism benefits and the other isn't really affected. The other is harmed in the interaction. Pardon me. And then mimicry is one where an organism looks like or behaves like another organism to either scare off a predator or camouflage itself. And we'll get into all of those categories further as we move through this unit. All right, energy flow in ecosystems. So the main source of energy for all ecosystems is usually going to be the sun. So energy from the sun is captured by producers. That would be your plants during photosynthesis. And they're going to take that energy and convert it to food, carbohydrates or sugars. That energy is then available to anything that eats the plant. The plant uses most of its own energy. It doesn't make sugars just so that we can eat them, but it is where we get all of our energy. It's the basis of all of these food chains. So some of that energy is going to be lost as heat or used up. But some of that energy that's been stored in the plants is going to be passed on to the organisms that eat the plants. And we call those the primary consumers. So they're the first consumers of the producers. They, in turn, are going to lose some of that energy to the environment, either through heat or waste. But then some of the energy that they store is also then going to be available to the things that eat them. So those would be secondary consumers. They lose some energy, and we move on up. Most food chains don't get much higher than 4 levels because there's not a ton of available energy by the time you get to the top. So we call these trophic levels. All food chains start with energy from the sun. It's captured by plants in that first level, and it usually goes up only 4 or 5 levels. Most of the energy gets used by the organism. So you eat the food, you use the energy for your life processes, and you store what's left over. That energy that's stored is what's available to whatever eats you. So here you have your producers, primary consumer, also known as an herbivore. Secondary consumer can be a carnivore, or sometimes they'll be omnivores, so they float around in both levels. And then you have a tertiary consumer, which would be your top level carnivore. And in the end, we're all broken down by the decomposers. And they're really important for ecosystems because they're going to recycle all of that organic matter so it can be reused. Another word for a producer is an autotroph, and another word for those consumers is going to be a heterotroph. So we say that sunlight is the main source of energy for almost all ecosystems, and photosynthesis is the process by which we convert, or plants convert, energy from the sun into sugars, which is organic compounds that we can utilize. So if you want to review photosynthesis, I would suggest going back and checking out some of the materials we have on that. Now, not all organisms use the sun. Some are actually going to be chemosynthesizers, so they make food from inorganic chemicals. There's some really cool bacteria that can do this, and they've found a bunch of them deep down in these hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. So we used to think that all ecosystems relied on the sun and there was no way to kind of have life without it. But when we travel down to the ocean floor, to these areas where there's no sunlight, it hasn't reached that far down, we didn't expect to find life, but they found this really thriving ecosystem that's based on this bacteria that can make food using the compounds that are coming out of these hydrothermal vents. So there's a lot of really cool research on that too. All right, so food chains and food webs. When we look at energy flow through ecosystems, sometimes we make these food chains, and it's just so that we can see the relationships between these organisms. So what is eating what, and what's going to happen if we remove these secondary consumers? How is that going to influence the rest of that little ecosystem there? So we use food chains to track energy flow. And the arrows show the direction of energy flow. So energy is going from the producer to the consumer. So the mouse is eating the plant, and so we have the arrow going in that direction. Be really careful because people tend to draw it in the wrong direction. But this is the way it should go. A food web is a little bit more complicated. It's where you take a bunch of food chains and put them together. This is a more accurate representation of what's going on, right? Because if you look at this, these aren't the only organisms that are present in that ecosystem. It's just one of the relationships that exists. Here, you have a more complete picture of what's going on in that ecosystem. And again, it's going to be useful if you're trying to study the effect of removing the leopard seal from this ecosystem. How is that going to influence the organisms below it and the organisms above it? And so oftentimes you'll make these food webs so that you can try to figure out how those organisms interact. Many species are going to fit into multiple levels. So even humans, we're omnivores. We eat meat and we eat plants, and so we can be primary consumers, secondary consumers, even tertiary consumers sometimes. And so we would fit into many levels within a particular food web. So do some practice looking at this food web. See if you can identify some primary consumers, secondary consumer, tertiary consumers, and then see if you can figure out who the omnivore is. So hopefully you've been able to go through an example of a producer would be the plants, Primary consumer, this grasshopper or this squirrel or this rabbit would both all be considered primary consumers. Secondary consumer, we've got your frog. Let's see, who else would be a secondary? So we've got 1, 2, the fox, 1, 2, the fox again, 1, 2, let's see, 1, 2, the snake. The tertiary consumers, let's see, so we can do 1, 2, 3. So you've got your owl as a tertiary consumer. 1, 2, 3. The snake could also be considered a tertiary consumer. And then the omnivore would be your mouse over here because it's a primary consumer. It eats this plant, but it also would eat the insect, so it's going to be secondary in there. Another way to look at energy flow in an ecosystem is looking at energy pyramids. So there's some different representations. You're going to be doing an activity where you model this, and we use what we call the 10% rule to think about the available energy as you move up an energy period. Basically, we say that about 10% of the energy at any level is available to the next level. So only about 10% of the energy that plants convert gets stored and is available for whatever's eating that plant, and it kind of goes from there. So you can see 100%, 10%, 1%, 0.1%. And this is part of the reason why there's so few third or higher level consumers. Some other kinds of pyramids that you might see are biomass pyramids or numbers, pyramids of numbers, and those generally are going to have the same kind of pattern where they get smaller up top, although there's some exceptions when you look at like a pyramid of numbers. So I hope that was helpful. It was kind of a quick run through of everything to do with the ecology vocabulary for now. We'll get into each of those things in a little bit more detail. Talk to you soon. Bye.